between short-term regulatory factors, which are seconds to minutes, and then longer acting factors, which we kind of alluded to last time. So at the level of the kidneys, at the level of balancing water through the collecting duct, at the level of the thirst centers in the brain, that is going to take a longer time to actually bring about a response. That's going to take minutes or even days, okay, to regulate blood volume. But we know that our short-term regulatory factors, this includes the heart, primarily through nerves. What division of the nervous system? The sympathetic, yep. So the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, primarily acting on arteries, acting on the heart, both the rate and the contractility, okay? So this is going to be more of a short-term regulatory factor on cardiac output and on total peripheral resistance, okay? And we're going to dissect each of these and see exactly how increasing heart rate, increasing stroke volume, increasing total peripheral resistance, all of those lead to an increase in mean arterial pressure. And this is much more of a short-term response than increasing blood volume, which also increases mean arterial pressure, but in a much more long-term fashion. Okay. All right, so we began looking at some of the players that are involved in this feedback loop, and this feedback loop should look very familiar. Last semester, we talked about the baroreceptor reflex, and we talked about sensors and detectors and communicators as a part of that negative feedback loop. And we're going to look more closely at the baroreceptor reflex again and talk about how the signal of pressure is regulated and corrected via the baroreceptor reflex. So the baroreceptors themselves, and we have different types of baroreceptors, so make sure you're distinguishing specifically which ones we're talking about. The ones on the arteries are going to detect pressure, right? High pressures or low pressures. And then we're going to speak about the ones that are in the venous system that usually detect more volume. They're low pressure receptors or volume receptors, and we'll talk about those later on. But basically, baroreceptors are detecting pressure. They're going to communicate to integrating centers, which are usually in the medulla. And then they're going to send a response via the autonomic nervous system. Again, something we've seen before. That is going to bring about some type of response in the heart and on the blood vessels, depending on our initial stimulus, whether it was an increase in pressure or a decrease in pressure. Okay, so the first type of baroreceptors we'll speak about are called arterial baroreceptors. They're located in two strategic areas. The carotid sinus, which is this swelling that has these nerve endings just proximal to where the carotids bifurcate, where they split off into internal and external. We also have baroreceptors at the aortic arch, and these two locations are really strategic, really important in determining pressure, in determining vascularization, right? The blood that's going to the brain as well as the blood that's going out to the peripheral tissues. And the receptors here are detecting the pressure in those circulations, okay? So really important to point out the strategic location of these receptors. And what they're detecting is the stretch on the wall in those vessels. So if we have high pressure, we're going to see a lot of stretch in that wall, and that is going to increase the firing frequency, the action potential frequency. And if we see decreased volume or decreased pressure, we're going to see less stretch on that wall, and that will decrease the action potential firing rate, which will decrease that signal sent to the brain. So they're responding to stretch, and the stretch is really talking about what the pressure in the artery looks like. Where are they communicating to? So they're communicating to the cardiovascular centers, which are in the medulla oblongata. And they're telling the medulla about whether or not there's an imbalance in the pressure. So if we have high pressure, there's a signal sent to the brain to detect that. And again, if you have low pressure, that signal is sent here as well. And the brain will either increase or decrease the parasympathetic and sympathetic response in an appropriate fashion to correct that, that dysfunction in pressure or that imbalance in pressure. Now, we also have different centers that convey messages to the cardiovascular center. So the hypothalamus is one that communicates signals about stress or anxiety. That too can play a role in heart rate. So if you're stressed about something, that can increase your heart rate. And we also have communication here from the cerebral cortex. So if you're thinking about things, so thoughts, memories, also communicate to the cardiovascular center. So not just physical parameters, but your heart rate can be manipulated by the hypothalamus and the cerebral cortex, which is like stress, anxiety, thoughts, and memories. All right, so what is the effect? Now the effect or the output signal is usually, if we have an increase, it's going to be to decrease the pressure. And if we have a decrease in pressure, it's going to be to get the pressure back up. So we send this signal out on the autonomic nerves, right? The efferent branch of our nervous system. And we can either stimulate the parasympathetic to the SA node and the AV node, right? We talked about this last semester. The parasympathetic influence on the ventricles is minimal, right? There's no influence of ventricular contractility from the parasympathetic system, only on the sympathetic system. So the parasympathetic really only influences the rate via the SA node and the AV node communication. Whereas the sympathetic response is much more extensive, okay? We're gonna see it affects the rate by the SA and AV node, but also the myocardium, so the ventricular contractility. The sympathetic system increases the contractility, basically how hard the heart is working, how forceful those contractions are. And then it also increases our arterial tone. So it's gonna increase arterial resistance, which is another way for saying increased vasoconstriction in our arterioles. It's also going to increase venomotor tone, okay? So it's going to increase, again, the constriction or contraction of that smooth muscle layer inside our veins. And all of these changes are working to bring about an increase in cardiac output. So if you increase stroke volume, or we increase heart rate, or in the case of veins, if we increase venous return, all those variables translate to increased cardiac output, which translate to increasing the mean arterial pressure, which was the first or the initial error signal, right? And so when we get pressure back up, we can turn that error signal off. Okay, again, this loop of events, right? This loop of events of homeostasis should be very familiar to you in terms of turning that error signal off, etc. So this image highlights those players and highlights the importance of the autonomic nervous system. So we can see the parasympathetic influence is only on the rate, so only on the SA node and the AV node, whereas the sympathetic response is much more extensive. So we're going to influence not only the SA and AV node, which increases heart rate, we're going to increase the ventricular contractility, so the heart's going to start working harder. That will increase stroke volume. We're going to increase the sympathetic tone, so the arterioles will contract. That will increase what? What factor does contraction increase? Resistance, right? Total peripheral resistance, which also works to increase mean arterial pressure. And then we're going to increase the sympathetic response on the veins, which causes contraction of the vein smooth muscle or increase in venomotor tone. And that increases what? Not resistance. So how does this influence mean arterial pressure? So increasing venomotor tone does what? It does increase pressure, which translates to what in terms of filling the heart? Yeah, it increases the end diastolic volume or your venous return, okay? So this will also translate to an increase in mean arterial pressure. So all of these factors in different ways are translating to an increase in mean arterial pressure, either through affecting heart rate or affecting stroke volume or affecting venous return. All of those variables also increase mean arterial pressure. All right, so we're going to walk through this sequence of events. We're going to describe the baroreceptor reflex. And this is a reflex that we looked at last semester. And this is basically in the face of decreased blood volume or decreased blood pressure. So think about bleeding out, hemorrhage, or losing blood volume if you're dehydrated. This is the response that's going to be elicited in your circulatory system to correct that imbalance in pressure. So we start off with a drop in mean arterial pressure. And when I say mean arterial pressure in your mind, you should be equating that to the perfusion pressure or the blood pressure, okay? Those terms are kind of synonymous and interchangeable. So we drop mean arterial pressure, we drop our perfusion pressure or blood pressure, and the baroreceptors that we just pointed out in the carotid sinus and in the aortic arch will detect that drop in pressure. They will then decrease their firing frequency rate, okay? So remember we said action potentials communicate by changing the frequency. So in order to communicate a signal of a decrease in pressure, we simply decrease the frequency of the action potentials. Now the first thing that is going to do is that is going to decrease parasympathetic activity, okay? And that will cause a decrease in the action potentials of the SA node, right? The SA node controls the rate of the heart or the heart rate. So as we increase action potential frequency, we will increase heart rate, okay? And that will kind of help to correct that mean arterial pressure drop. But that's only one side of the coin. We will also increase sympathetic activity. We talked about this comparative secrecy last semester. So in order to bring about a response, not only do we have to increase sympathetic, but we must tone down the parasympathetic as well. And those things together in concert give us the change that will correct this imbalance or correct this pressure drop. So let's talk about the different variables that increased sympathetic activity brings about. So the first one is ventricular myocardium, the increased contractility. So the heart begins to pump harder. And remember, only the sympathetic system influences the contractility of the heart. Only the sympathetic system influences the myocardial contractile cells, okay? So they begin to work harder, they increase their contractility. What does that mean? What does that translate to? Yep. Yeah, that increases our stroke volume. Awesome. So we increase stroke volume, which we know is a determinant of mean arterial pressure. So that's one factor. We also increase venomotor tone. So we kind of just talked about that. We increase the sympathetic influence on those veins, that smooth muscle. We have constriction or contraction of the smooth muscle that encourages venous return, and that will help to get more blood back to the heart. And remember, that is decreasing the compliance of the veins. That's making them a little bit more elastic, right? They're putting a little bit more pressure on that venous blood to get it back to the heart. So we increase venous pressure, we increase end-diastolic volume, we increase venous return. And then the last factor here is increasing vasoconstriction. So we increase vasoconstriction on arterioles, and that brings about an increase in total peripheral resistance, okay? Now, where do we increase vasoconstriction? Let's say again, in this scenario, we're bleeding out or we have low blood volume, dehydrated. Where do we want to increase total peripheral resistance or cause vasoconstriction? Is it everywhere in the body? No. What organ system is exempt? The brain. The brain is exempt. The heart is also exempt in this scenario as well. So at the expense of all of our other tissues where we see vasoconstriction, the brain and the heart do not vasoconstrict. They maintain their normal perfusion. And so the other tissues are basically sacrificing their blood flow to maintain the heart and the brain, okay? Now, I do want to point out here, we also have another factor that's influencing the arterioles. So in the face of, again, hemorrhage or dehydration, we also have local regulatory factors that are playing a role. So we have local metabolites that are also building up. So this is what prevents over or excess vasoconstriction. The combative nature of the local metabolites that are keeping some level of flow, right? Remember, if we have buildup of those metabolites, such as acid, such as potassium, such as carbon dioxide, we're going to see a little bit of vasodilation. So that prevents excessive vasoconstriction in most of our arterioles, and that's what actually keeps the rest of our body alive, right? At the expense of moving that blood to the brain and the heart. Okay. Another thing that I want to point out here is that the baroreceptor reflex is not the end all and be all, right? This can easily be overridden. And if you think about high blood pressure, so people who have sustained high blood pressure, they basically shut this whole thing off, okay? So you basically dial in a new set point. And there are many different reasons for high blood pressure. They can be like kidney trouble or heart failure. But if you have sustained high blood pressure, your baroreceptors will detect that high pressure as the new pressure. That becomes the new normal. And so you shut off this reflex, and that is why it becomes hard to correct blood pressure if you've had high blood pressure for a long period of time. So it's really important to understand that this is not the end all be all. This can be overridden. We're going to talk about some other scenarios a few slides down where this process is overridden. Okay. What's another scenario that we can override this process? What's another way that you can think of that we can easily override this regulatory process? So what if we continue to lose blood volume? Will this work indefinitely? No, it won't, right? So if we're continually hemorrhaging blood, this also gets overridden. This gets turned off. And our peripheral tissues will say, okay, we've had enough. They will begin to vasodilate, right? They will start to grab that blood back from the heart and brain. And that's where we get into shock, right? Circulatory shock. And that's where this becomes fatal, okay? When the peripheral tissues have had enough, they've stopped vasoconstricting, they've started vasodilating, and they're taking blood from the heart and brain, and that's where this becomes detrimental. So this can easily be overridden, but it's a really important part of this reflex, which helps to keep our mean arterial pressure up.